Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome. My name is David Kasher. I'm a rabbi at IKAR, and I'm very excited to welcome you all to the beginning of our speaker series this year at IKAR. We have a speaker series every year, and for a while now, it's been sponsored by Lisa and Maury Friedman. And so I just want to start by giving them a huge thanks. You know, it's people don't just sponsor things because they have the means to do so, but because they care about ideas and they care about things that the rest of us here care about, but they're making that possible. So really thank you for that. Our series this year is on the theme of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we've got 4 speakers speaking to different aspects of that. And I'm very excited today to welcome Rabbi Benay Lappy, who is a friend, a kind of soul sister, a teacher to me, really a hero to me in many ways. Rabbi Benay Lappy is, I'll just, some important vitals here, is the founder and Rosh Yeshiva of Svara. Svara, a traditionally radical yeshiva is the tagline. I think you might also say a queer yeshiva. Rabbi Lappy was ordained at JTS in 1997. I had the pleasure of attending the ceremony where Rabbi Lappy got a Covenant Award, sort of like the big award in our world, in the Jewish educator world, which was so totally deserved. She really is one of the great Torah teachers of our time. And maybe you've gone to one of the queer Talmud camps that she runs, or maybe you've gone to a crash talk that she's given and you've had some opportunity to learn and think with Benay before. But if you haven't, you're really in for a treat tonight. I just will one more kind of word of introduction here to introduce how I came to know Benay, which is that I was a rabbinic intern when I was at rabbinical school. And I was at a modern Orthodox rabbinical school, and I was doing an internship at the University of Chicago. I was at the Hillel there, but specifically for the Orthodox kids at the Hillel. There was one of those Hillels where they have like an Orthodox community and a conservative. So I'm just like this kind of dorky little rabbinical student, and I think I would fly there from rabbinical school every so often. And one of these weekends where I stayed there, I had some extra time. I guess it was a Sunday or something like that, after Shabbat, before Shabbat, something like that. And I saw a flyer and that was posted somewhere, and it was like a lecture on the Talmud. So I was like, well, this is great. What an opportunity. I have some free time and I'm going to go hear a lecture on the Talmud. And I went, and I didn't realize that it was sponsored by the Gender Studies Department. And I think it probably had queer somewhere in the title, but I don't know if I didn't realize that either. I just was like, sure, on Talmud. So I went to Talmud. And when I walked in the room, I got the vibe that like, maybe I was like a little bit didn't quite fit in the scene there. It was like I was like in my plaid shirt and my kind of little kippah, and I was this nerdy Orthodox kid. And the talk began, and it was my introduction to queer theory, as well as a whole new take on the Talmud. And it was an interesting hour. I think at one point someone said, well, what would like an Orthodox person to say to this? And I remember that Rabbi Lappy said, well, I think we have one here. What would you say? It was just like, quite a moment. And I said something that passed, just so, you know, I didn't get in too much trouble.
What you said, I'll never forget. What you said is, all of this radical stuff that Benay is saying is deeply traditional. And that was so affirming to me because, you know, I didn't go to a yeshiva like you did. And to have someone with your education say to me, yeah, you know, she's not making this shit up.
Yeah,
this is for real. Really meant a lot.
Yeah, right. No, that is how I felt. And I'll tell you how else I felt. With this, I'll end my introduction, which is that I went to this lecture, and an hour later, I saw my whole tradition differently. I saw the Talmud differently. I saw the Torah differently. I saw my whole, for someone to be able to do that to you in an hour when you're a rabbinical student is pretty incredible. So, I've been just like following Benay around since then. And really just thrilled to have you here tonight. and really thrilled to have Rabbi Lappe kick off our series on diversity, equity, and inclusion because, and here we'll get into it, when I was like excited, been working at IKAR for 3 years now and looking for an opportunity to get Benay to come and teach for us. I think you have a lot of fans already in our community. And I said, okay, so our series this year is on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Would you be down to speak on that? And Benay said, yeah, I'm happy to talk about inclusion, but you should know I don't believe in inclusion at all. So I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be interesting. So, so let's get interesting. What in the world do you mean by that? That's inclusion's nice. We all love inclusion. These are diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is the theme of our series because these are values that we care about, and we're striving to be a more inclusive community. So, what do you mean when you say you don't believe in inclusion? And
okay,
here, turn it over to Benay.
Okay, so not everybody loves inclusion. People who are already on the inside love inclusion because they have misdiagnosed the problem that they think they're solving by trying to bring people who are not currently in the space into the space. And it is the wrong solution for the wrong problem. Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me. I want to thank IKAR. I want to thank you, David. Inclusion is the subject that I just love to rant about because I am so passionate about how wrong-headed it is. And it just stuns me that so much of the Jewish world thinks they're doing the right thing and thinks we're going to solve all of our problems with inclusion. So let me tell you more about why I think inclusion is completely wrong-headed. I'm going to throw out some shorthand terms. So first, let me introduce some shorthand terms that I'm going to use. And these come from my theory, which you referred to, called the crash theory. And in 1 minute flat, the crash theory is the basic notion that at a certain point, inevitably, the story that we were raised with or born into or accepted as telling us what's right and how to live is going to crash. We are going to realize that it is profoundly lacking, either because we like another story better or something inside of us has changed or something has happened in the world, and that's called a crash. And at that moment, you have three choices. You can deny the crash and revert to your master story and take refuge there and dig in, build a wall around that story and, try to make it as good as you can make it. And that's called option one. Or you can completely reject your master story and jump off into a brand new story, the story of the crash. That's basically saying, I'm out of here. That's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You're out of the game. Or option three is retelling the master story, recreating another culture with the values that the first one didn't have and with practices the first one was lacking to become a more liberatory story. Okay, having gotten that out in a really short way, here's the problem with inclusion. Inclusion is saying, how can I get people who are not in my option one into my option one? And you're not asking, why are they not here now? Okay, your option one doesn't suck because all these other people, queer people and people of color and disabled folk and you name it, it doesn't suck because they're not here. They're not here because it sucks. Okay, I hope I can.
So wait. So what you mean? Let me see if I'm tracking this. So what you mean is, like, the master story is not working for, let's say, queer people or many other people.
Yeah.
And the idea of inclusion is, well, we're going to keep this master story, but you're welcome to show up. Come on, like, just sit here in the pew, and we're going to keep telling our basic story, our option one. Right? And as opposed to what? As opposed to what would you do instead?
Okay, so let me get more specific. One of the things that sucks about the master story or option one spaces, the status quo, is that since these spaces were created primarily by white, straight, cisgender, able-bodied people, for the most part, the spaces are deeply culturally that. And what we know about culture is that you're usually not aware of it. It's the water that you swim in if it's your culture. So if you are white and straight and cisgender and so on, that space feels like home for you. And to say, gosh, I want to invite other people to come live in my home, isn't that a good thing? It seems like a good thing, but actually that place will never, ever, ever be home to folks who hold a different culture and different values than the values that are embedded in those cultures. So to quote unquote include all those other people, you are just setting them up. It's almost insulting. It's like, you don't even realize why the folks that you want to be here are either not interested in coming or are unhappy once they come. And you typically don't even realize the extent to which they are forced to constrict their fabulous, different, glittery, outrageous selves to fit into your culture. And at the end of the day, you're never going to actually benefit. This space isn't going to be able to even benefit from all that they have to bring. Mm-hmm. So that's my first volley on inclusion.
Okay, let's see if I can hit it back. So I mean, then the question becomes, okay, I'll be like the white, straight, cisgendered. Like the question is, okay, there's some kind of awakening, and we realize in the mainstream, hey, we're leaving people out. I mean, that seems like a good awakening, right? And we want, so
yes.
So then what like, should we not extend the sort of gesture of, like, what instead do I think I'm hearing you say we need to go back and reinvestigate some of the assumptions of our community? Or is it, no, like, we're never going to be a community that can accommodate everybody? Like, how then does one proceed once one feels, oh, it was a bad thing that these people are that we're not together, that these people don't feel like they can enter this space?
I have to be honest with you. I'm kind of two minds. Part of me feels like, you know what? If you're white and you're straight and you're cis and whatever, gang is trade. Go be that and be really good at doing tshuva, because you are going to mess up a lot and you are going to hurt people a lot. And be really open to hearing that and doing tshuva, and let folks who really deserve a space where they can be fully themselves make dedicated spaces for themselves. Okay, that's the sort of the most, and call it a day. That's the most radical version of my I hate inclusion diatribe. I suppose the more moderate version is, and by the way, I'm not very good at solving this problem.
You're just a troublemaker.
I have the luxury of sort of curating one of these dedicated spaces. But we also at Svara are very thoughtful and careful about how we do that, so that the culture of the space remains what we want it to be for the people we want to be fully present there. So I'll get back to, like, what can places that
right
let me get back to that.
Let's go in the radical direction first, right? Let's accept the radical premise and say, yeah, enjoy and be ready to do tshuva, but in the meantime, what we need is queer spaces, is alternate spaces, and so, okay, so, and you built one. So what does that look? Why that space? And what does that look like to have a queer space, or like, especially in the Jewish context, what does it mean to have a space that is marked, is distinct in that way? Like, how do you think of that?
Yeah. So first of all, Svara is a queer and trans space. And we are very careful to be sure that as we get more and more successful, we don't let everybody in. Because if we let everybody in who wants to come in, we would start becoming a sort of a straight dominated, white dominated, put a sticky on white, because we are really struggling and working hard to eradicate white supremacy in our own space. You know, as a white person who started it, you know, that was my task, but I'll come back to that. To give you an example, we have a two-part registration process for every program we have. For any space we convene, you have to apply, and we are very careful to make sure we are admitting folks in the demographics that we want to be in our space. And if people are applying who are in that demographic, for example, we work hard to make sure that trans femme folk are in the space and represented. So a trans femme person who comes to Svara isn't the only one. They don't look around and go, oh, I'm the only one. They need to look around and see a lot of people who look like them. And
that seems key. That seems like a key element. And as we talked through this a little bit before, you mentioned that a number of times, that a big piece of this, the thing that sucked about the space was that I didn't see people like me.
That's right.
A big piece of that, right?
It is. And not only that, the person in front of the room has got to be a kal v'chomer to everybody else in the room. Okay, what do I mean by that? As you know, we made sort of a rule a long time ago that there will never be a person in front of the room at Svara who's not queer or trans. And that's because we want to be sure that every queer and trans person who's sitting in the room looks at the teacher and goes, that could be me. And goes, wow, if you love Torah, if you think this thing is worthwhile, if you think the rabbis are cool, well, then for sure I will, right? That's the kal v'chomer. The kal v'chomer is, if you know something is true for an unlikely case, you can deduce that the same thing is true for a more likely case. Here's an example of a kal v'chomer. My arm hurts. I go to the doctor. The doctor says, Benay, there's nothing wrong with your arm. You actually have a back problem. And here's my prescription. You may not, I don't want you to carry even a purse, okay? Because that's gonna make your back go out of, out of alignment. Don't even carry a purse. Okay, that I know for a fact because my doctor told it to me. Now I go home. Can I move my refrigerator out of my kitchen and into my basement? Could I put that refrigerator on my back and move it into the basement? Would that be okay with my doctor? No, for sure, 100%. My doctor didn't say anything about refrigerators, but if I know what the doctor said about the purse being too heavy and dangerous, for sure I know that about the refrigerator. Okay, so the teacher has to be the kal v'chomer. The rabbi in front of the room has to be the kal v'chomer to everyone else in the space. In other words, gosh, if Benay, who's had all these horrible experiences from the straight world, Benay, who's a lesbian, Benay, who's queer, if she loves this thing, for sure I will. It's not going to help the queer person in the room to see a straight cisgender man say from the front of the room, I love this tradition. The queer person's like, yeah, sure, you love it. I get why you love it. You have power in this thing. It reflects you. Well, why should I love it? You haven't convinced me. Okay, so leadership is really important. So to get back to, go ahead.
Well, I think we should, I mean, I have lots of questions about where this might go and thinking about this model, but I kind of want to jump in right now and talk a little bit. Well, so why do you love it? Because after all, isn't the Talmud, the Torah, all this stuff, isn't that also the old master story? I mean, it's the same stuff that people are, preaching in the, from the straight pulpit, so to speak. Like, what does it mean to say, I am the queer teacher and I love this? Like, what's distinct about that? What's unique about why Torah? Why Talmud? I'd love to hear you think a little bit about that too.
The reason I love the tradition is because when I look at the most insider version of it, like what I think is really about at its core, sort of the secret tradition that has been held for 2,000 years for the most sophisticated insiders, which itself is a messed up thing, and Svara exists to disrupt that and to spread it and distribute it to everyone else. But that inner tradition is recorded in the Talmud, and it is phenomenally courageous and willing to overturn itself. It's willing to say, you know what, God's self said this. I'm not buying it. It doesn't work for me. My inner moral intuition, my svara, feels like that's wrong. And here's a tradition that says you should use your svara, your inner moral intuition, shaped by your life experiences and your deep understanding of human beings and their relationships. And I'm paraphrasing Menachem Elon on this definition, shaped and refined by your learning to overturn Torah. And that fact is the most Jewish thing about Judaism, and I'm in love. Everything else is either a problem.
It's the most Jewish thing about Judaism, and I think I hear you saying, and it's very queer. Like, there's not,
yes,
this tradition is queerer than we thought.
That's right. That's right. Because what it means to be queer is to have a profound experience of otherness, whatever that otherness is about. Whether it's about gender or sexual orientation or race or ability, you name it, or some life experience that just taught you something that's not part of the main knowledge of the world. And you embrace and embody the insights from that experience, and you march them through the world as a critique on the mainstream. That's what it means to be queer. And by this definition, not every gay person is queer. And there are a bunch of straight people who are queer. Okay, just to confuse things even more.
Yeah, okay. All right. So, and I want to say, in about 10, 15 minutes, I'll open up to questions. We won't talk to each other the whole time, and we'll do that probably in the chat. So get ready in about 10 minutes, and I'll take questions from the chat. But I think I want, before we do, to just think a little bit about, okay, well, where does all this go? Meaning, is this what we call in the Talmud like a b'diavad? Is this like, yeah, we live in a screwed up world whose master story no longer applies, and things need to be repaired. And in the meantime, inclusion's not the solution to that. You don't just bring everybody in and say, okay, we're all good now. I think I get that. But is that b'diavad? Is that like plant? That's because we're in this situation where we're just realize there's a long, but the ideal is we're all together.
No,
like the ideal is we all come together, or no.
Yeah,
I say that, Benay, I say that in part because what you just said, I need that. I need that queer Torah. I got it from you. It reshaped. Like, we all need that, right? So, do we eventually reshape the main space now with some queer perspective, or no? There's always a queer space separate from the main space.
There's so much. There's so much in there. First of all, I think there's always a separate space. I think there always should be a separate space, and that separate space will be inhabited and cultivated by people who are on the increasing edge. In other words, one day queer folk are going to not be queer anymore. You know, there's always someone queerer than you coming up. And, you know, our job is to hold our truths very lightly, because the queer folk who are coming up already are here to shake up the things that we think are, you know, the ultimate expression of values, you know, non-heteronormativity. So I think there will always be a need for dedicated affinity spaces for those queerest of the queer folk who are coming up to clarify their own Torah, to sort of hear each other's voices, see themselves in one another, and gain the confidence that they need to bring to the larger space, and to bring their voice without having to quiet, and to know what it feels like to be liberated in these spaces, so that when they're in other spaces and they don't feel that, they go, wait a minute, something's wrong here. Okay, so that was one thing.
So then
You
there's
said,
like,
yeah.
I think I'm beginning to see that there's, I mean, and this fits into the very quick description you gave us of a like master story option of rejecting that. I see how it fits into that in the sense that the other space, right? If you imagine there's one space and another space, that mechanism of there being one space and another, that's an essential mechanism that actually, it's not b'diavad, we always need the other space that is creating a kind of, I don't know, fringy outsider perspective that will always be necessary, because the mainstream always has to be challenged and reawakened and queerified, so to speak.
For sure.
All right.
For sure. And the quote unquote main spaces, the main spaces have the problem that the late Clayton Christensen called the innovator's dilemma. And what Clayton Christensen said was, for a player in a current market, whether it's business, whether it's in the Jewish world, a synagogue, you name it, a player in that current market has a real problem attracting new customers, people who are not current users, because it is obligated to satisfy the needs of its current customers. And the extent to which it appeals to a new market is going to leave its current customers dissatisfied. So the question for mainstream spaces, option one spaces, the quote unquote main space is, what are you willing to give up? How much comfort and security are you willing to give up which will happen? This discomfort will happen when you change your culture, and you've got to change your culture before you invite people to come into it.
Okay, good. I mean, that's like, we have to consider that a little bit, because I may agree with the ultimate truth of what you're saying, but we're still, I mean, at IKAR, we're still going to we want queer folks to show up. Like, we want it to be a welcoming space for queer folk. Like, so, you know what? Fine, we can't presume that we just like welcome and then we're done. But like, what do we do? Like, what does it mean to be at least open to the reshaping of your culture and all of that, the terror that suggests? There's something about that that's scary.
Yeah.
So what does that look like?
Also, to give you an illustration, and I think that our tradition gave us stories about how to disrupt spaces that have bad culture. And the story of Rabbi Gamliel, right? Famous story from the Tractate of Brachot. Rabbi Gamliel is the head of the yeshiva. He's the head of the academy. And, you know, I debated all afternoon. What should I call Rabbi Gamliel when I talk about him? Should I say he's an asshole? Can I call Rabbi Gamliel? I don't want to do that. Should I say he's a dick? And I don't want to do that. He's kind of a jerk. All right, I'll leave it at that. He's abusive. Okay. Every rabbi in the Talmud would agree with me about that. He's abusive. He is overbearing. He is violent. He is sort of
he's a supremacist.
Right, beautiful. And so the Talmud tells the story of Rabban Gamliel, and it gives us a glimpse of the culture he has created in the yeshiva, you know, where he bullies the students and he makes the ones who disagree with him stand up throughout the whole lecture, and he forces students to violate the Torah as they understand it in order to conform their behavior to him. I mean, he's right. So you have to imagine that the space of the yeshiva of old was a very violent space. And so what happens? Finally, the students depose him. But they don't just depose the guy in front of the room who's creating this culture. They depose also the guards at the door, right? The guards at the gate, and the rules, the litmus tests that used to be in place that sifted out who could come in and who couldn't. And then they set up benches, hundreds of benches. And in my imagination, and I want to credit my colleague and teacher and friend Lainey Solomon for this beautiful take on this story. In their imagination, Lainey's imagination, they set up the benches first, and they got rid of all the power structures that made the culture of the space what it was. And only then did they open the doors and say, okay, come on in, whoever wants to come in. And that's when, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students come in. Now that we've gotten rid of this old culture, now we have a space to establish a new culture. And what's the first thing they do when they sort of occupy the yeshiva? The queer folk who had been kept out. They ask, who have we kept out? Who is queerer than us, right? Who are the people who we've always accepted are out of the community? They need to be here. Okay.
That sounds like something that you have to deal with now. Now, managing a kind of a queer Jewish space, you're also now asking these questions of yourself and your space, and the constant self-questioning that you're presenting as a like, hey, you know, think about this straight community, that actually ends up being part, like, everybody's going to have to do that constant self-question.
For sure. Look, I in a lot of ways, I'm an old school lesbian. You know, when I started Svara 18 years ago, I was already using the word queer in the way I described, but I didn't have any friends yet who were trans, and I didn't understand the depth of trans Torah. And then, you know, some trans students start coming, and I'm realizing, oh my God, there are truths bigger than mine. And I learned to hold my truths really lightly and to have them be part of the trans folk and the disabled folk and the, you name it, have them be part of the shapers of the space. And I think Svara has been so successful because I've learned to get out of the way and let the folks who are, you know, however you want to say it, queerer than me, have a bigger picture of what the world could look like and what needs to happen in a liberatory space to run the space. There's a point at which, you know, we all need to say, I put my Torah out there, and I'm gonna sit back and let them do it, because they're going to do it better than me.
And what about, and soon I'll turn this over to like taking some questions from the group. So so you can start to place questions in the chat if you want. In a couple of minutes, I'll start taking questions from I think that's the best way to do it. It'll be hard to navigate the Zoom otherwise, but I'll take questions from the chat. What about the other direction? Like, what about a straight folk, like, you know, you're talking about having people in the space who are challenging your assumptions. What about the old school option one people? I mean, you know, I've been in your space. Like, you have straight folks in your space. What's their role in your space? Do you encourage like the straight and I don't just mean gender, but like the straight thinkers to like be exploring in queer spaces? Like, what's the dynamic there in the other direction, or is there one? Do you care?
Yeah, we care, because one thing I learned a long time ago is no matter how queer I am in front of the room, if the majority of folks in the room are straight, cisgender folk, I can't single-handedly create a queer culture. It just can't happen. And so, you know, Svara is a home for queer and trans Torah, and there needs to be space for us to create that. And so we are really careful about how many straight folk come into the space. I mean, I'll be honest,
Yeah.
we're that's the
I
truth.
mean, because I hear you pointing to a dynamic that is difficult, but sort of unavoidable, where, you know, look, we're not in a redeemed world yet. So like, it's easy to be like, well, Klal Yisrael, we're all together, yay. But like, we're not there yet. And part of what we need to get there is a space that actually, some of the things like the numbers of people in the room or the person in front of the room, things that like, it's very easy to say, oh, but that doesn't matter, we're all people. But it does matter if you're trying to create a space that actually allows for this kind of new energy, this new, and for people who are already in that story to feel like, yes, I found my space.
That's right, absolutely. And, you know, all of us who get funding from the funding world are pulled to hit numbers. And everyone thinks that success means as many people as possible in the room. And I think we really have to push back on that. You have to be willing to keep people out, to keep the people that you want in, to keep the culture that you want to create intact.
Yeah, you didn't lie. You're really not into inclusion.
I am so not into inclusion.
All right, so that's good. So I think we've gotten somewhere, but let's hear from some other voices. And if you want to chat me directly, I'll take some prerogative in just sort of making sure the questions are, you know, come from different places and topics. But I'd love to hear folks ask questions, and I'll sort of act as the voice for those questions. I have a really interesting one here from Roseanne, who asks for an example, like what specific text or mitzvah or something gets disrupted in a queer space? Like we know that there's like, you know, the prohibitions on you know, anal sex or something. We could talk about, but are there other, like, what gets disrupted in a queer space? Like, do you have examples of like what changes, what looks different aside from the representation? What actually, how does that affect the Torah in the room?
Oh my God, it's a fantastic question, and the answer is, it's so, on the one hand, it's so profound. On the other hand, it's so subtle that I'm afraid my words are not going to be adequate to capture it. There is, in a queer space, there is a feeling, there is a kind of open, loving, playful, irreverent, sometimes outrageous feeling. It's, you know, as one of our students, David Frankel, once said, it's not that anything goes, it's that anything might be. There's a possibility. So it's not about rules. It's not about like, what are the mitzvah?
It's a vibe thing.
It's a vibe thing. It's a vibe thing. It's a feeling thing. And you've all felt it whenever you've felt most fully yourself. And I think the truth is that most of us probably have never felt fully ourselves in a lot of Jewish spaces. And so we don't even recognize what it isn't and what it needs to be and what it could be. And I think that's the power of dedicated spaces. There is the ability when you're with your people, you have the ability to explore, what does it mean to be me? What does it mean to be so I fear I'm not giving a good answer to this, and I need to think more about it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, look, first of all, one of the things I like about you as a teacher is that you pause. Like a sign of a great teacher. They're like, and to say I don't know is also like a sign of a great teacher. But you do know something. I mean, you did create something. Like you had this idea that there has to be a thing in the world, and you know, like where did that come from? I mean, you decided like this is the space that we're going to create, and we're going to study the Talmud, and we're going to do it in this way. And there's a lot of infrastructure and rules and discourse, and like it isn't just like just a vibe thing. There's a lot of like you've got a whole system. So like, why that system? Like, why that space?
There are two reasons why I started Svara. Number one, I started because I needed it. I had been out as an activist for a decade before I decided to go to rabbinical school, and JTS wasn't accepting openly queer folk at that time. And I had the feeling, you know, Art Waskow said, and I read in a book, I was sitting in Japan where I lived, and he said, we all stood at Mount Sinai. We were all there. And I thought to myself, oh my God, if that's true, the Torah is mine. It's like, that was given to me. That's my inheritance. And I can't go where I'm going to get access to it. The Talmud is mine, and I can't go to this rabbinical school where I could learn it. I was like, fuck you. That's mine. You cannot keep it from me. And I'm going to take it. And so, you know, I went into the closet to Robin Hood what was really mine in the first place, that they weren't willing to give me, to bring it to the folks who weren't going to make the ridiculously neurotic decision to go into the closet for 6 years to get that Torah, and I could bring it to them because I knew that the tradition was profoundly broken.
You're saying this in an aside, but it's a big deal. Like you had to be closeted for 6 years in rabbinical school. Like that's you had to mask yourself in order to get to Robin Hood.
Yeah,
right? That's a big deal.
It was, and I'm still recovering, but we'll leave that aside. I knew that queer people, because I had already lived in queer culture for, you know, almost 15 years at that point. I knew that we were onto something. I knew that we knew truths that the main world and that Judaism didn't know. And but yet I was in love with Judaism, and I knew what it had done to the world and how much it had to bring. And I thought, I'm invested in making it better. And to make it better, a whole bunch of people who have really good svara and smart Torah from their lives need to get, you know, push up their sleeves and get their hands dirty and start making it better. You know, it was clear to me that the rabbinical schools were doing the wrong thing in admitting only those candidates who for whom the tradition worked best. You don't make leaders out of the people for whom the tradition works best. You make leaders out of the people for whom the tradition works least well. Because they're going to be the kal v'chomer to everyone else in the room. They're the ones who know what needs to be fixed. So I wanted to get those people onto the field, this new team onto the field of players who are going to make Judaism better.
And I gotta say, as you say that, I'm thinking like, right, like Moses was our teacher because he was raised in a different culture. Like Rabbi Akiva was our teacher because he started when he was 40. Like that's the queer perspective, and it's always that the vanguard is always the queer perspective.
Exactly. It's not an accident also that among the early rabbis, a disproportionate number of them were converts or children of converts, right? They were the folks who, you know, they could have gone to the temple down the block, but didn't, while they were advocating for a Judaism without a temple and doing the work to create a Judaism without a temple while the temple was still standing. Okay, these were the outlaws of their time. They were the ones who were like, this thing is broken. Yeah. You know, you can connect the dots to some of the radical moves that this next generation of largely queer and trans leaders are going to make. Great. They're going to shake us up a lot. And I just want to add one final thing. Specifically, why is it important to have queer and trans folk creating Torah? If the studies are right, and there are a couple of studies, they're preliminary, but they're already out there, Gen Z is somewhere between 34 and 52% queer identifying. Okay, now what that means is they regardless of their own gender or sexual orientation, they subscribe to a certain culture, worldview, set of values. That is what they will expect Judaism to reflect, and I think Judaism should reflect it. Now, Judaism shouldn't always reflect everything the cult that comes into the, but what they're saying is heteronormativity, bye-bye. Cis heteronormativity, bye-bye. Misogyny, patriarchy, bye-bye. You know, gender binary, bye-bye. So, and yeah.
No, don't interrupt.
We're going to need leaders to hold the spaces for those Jewish folk to walk into.
I'm jumping in because you're in some ways beginning to answer a question that I just saw come in the chat here. Emily asks, how does Judaism change if the queer people only play in their own room? And I'd love, can you give a little more language to that? I think some of what you were saying applies directly to that, which is like, well, look, the world is changing. Like, if 34% of Gen Z people think of themselves as queer, that something's changed. But how does that happen? What is the change that ends up happening when, as Emily says, queer people are playing in their own room?
Here's how it works. And this goes back to Clayton Christensen and disruptive innovation. The model of disruptive innovation is that with very, very few exceptions, and I can tell you the story of one famous exception another time or now if you want, with few exceptions, the current players will never be able to disrupt themselves to attract the new customers. And so the model of disruptive innovation as applied to Judaism goes like this. The queer folk, and now I mean queer writ large, the folks on the margins, they need to be created, not like looking back to the current centers, but creating a new center, new spaces that reflect their understanding of what liberation is going to look like for everybody. Okay? A queer space, just as an example, isn't a space that's like, oh, this is good for queer folk. Just like a feminist space isn't a space that's good for women, right? Feminism isn't about creating a world that's good for women. Feminism is about creating a world that's good for everybody. By making sure that, by bringing in the the values of and making sure women are okay. One day, feminist spaces will have a majority of men and still be feminist. Feminist spaces will have a guy in front of the room and a majority men in the space, and they'll still be feminist. That will happen one day. It's not happening yet. But again, these spaces out here that now look like the margins are already becoming spaces that are attractive to lots of people that are pulling away from the old center, old/current, whatever, former center, who are realizing, oh my gosh, I feel kind of uptight and judged and not really seen in this space. And straight people say all the time when they come this far, I never felt this way before, right? They're in a queer space and they realize what it feels like to feel really free. So eventually some number of folks, not everybody, some number of folks will peel away from what is the former center, former/current center, and these new centers are going to grow and grow and grow. That's the model. It is not going to happen that the current spaces are going to get better and better and better as they invite or include people that the culture of this space can't hold. That's not gonna, it's not the way any major change works.
But I gotta say, I mean, I don't know. Like, I gotta say, this whole thing, in one way, I find very convincing, very compelling. But I have to say, like, I think about my own community, and I guess I don't know if IKAR is a queer shul, but I mean, we have got a lot of queer folks, and we love them, and we have queer rabbi on our team, and it's like it does feel like I'm not saying we're doing the greatest thing in the world. I'm not like claiming any credit for anything. I just feel like, but like queer people want to be in our community. We want them there. Like, isn't this some of, like, you're saying something in a very absolute way. It's never going to happen in a, and I'm not calling IKAR a straight space. Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's some place in the middle, some hybrid of, but I just wonder, like, it's not like defined as the alternative queer space, or maybe it is. Maybe IKAR is queer in some way. Maybe that's one way of thinking about it. But I still feel like when I look at our community and the kind of love we feel as one big community, some of whom are queer and some are not, that also feels like a model. And what's like, isn't there meaning and value in that model? It's just not your thing, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be that. It could be that it works for some queer folk and it doesn't work for other queer folk. But as queer people get straighter and straighter, and that's why I like to distinguish the word queer from gay. Queer people have gotten really straight. Just like Jews have gotten very unedgy as we've gotten wealthier as a whole, and as we've gotten more enfranchised and free and powerful, and oh God, so many stickies on that. But
it's like Pete Buttigieg 2020. It's like, great, but also that's not my necessary. Right?
Yeah,
yeah. We still need some queerer folks than that.
Yeah.
God bless Pete Buttigieg. No, no shade on Pete Buttigieg, but
yeah,
right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Let me problematize one last thing before we close, and then and maybe try to look towards some kind of future vision. What about just like in the space, in the Tova asked this question, in the space that you create, you alluded to sometimes actually that space gets challenged. And sometimes maybe queer folks show up there and don't actually feel like I belong and this is my space. Like, I'd love to, like, maybe you're a model to the rest of us. Like, well, how do you deal with those challenges? And how do you redefine your own space? You've got this queer space, but now there are there's the queerer voice, or the trans voice, or the challenging your assumptions voice. How does that work at Svara?
We know what we do is we make sure that we set up leaders. We sort of strengthen the Torah of the queerest, of the folks who aren't yet represented, make sure they're in sort of the leadership pipeline before we're inviting them to come be sort of users or consumers in this space. Before we want to invite them as students, we actually want to scoop them into leadership training, make sure they have mentorship and support by people who can support them in their identities in ways we can't if we don't represent their identities, and then have them sort of share the front of the room with us so that folks who share their identity will come because they, now in the front of the room, have shifted the culture at Svara as leaders. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
And
yeah.
it's a very slow process. And it's, you know, we've got spilkies for sure. And Lainey always reminds me, this is slow and we have to do it right. And it's not the inclusion model.
It's not the inclusion model.
Yeah.
I want to end not on a problem, but just on, you know, a dream. Like what dreams do you have? What's the queer future? What's the future of Torah? Like, what are you hoping, like the next generation, you know, takes up? Where do you hope Svara goes? Like, you know, give us some of your dreams for the future.
My dream for the future is a Judaism which has resuscitated its courageous, radical roots and centers the experience of those on the most marginal of margins constantly, with the understanding that they have the truths that we need, and allowing them to mess with the tradition, giving them the space and the learning they need to be the upgraders and the shapers of the future. Because they're going to be, as Kal v'chomers to all the rest of us, they're going to be the shapers of a future that works not just for them, but for everyone downstream of them. And that's all the rest of us. All the rest of us are downstream of the queerest folk.
In other words, and sort of to summarize here, it's a world in which it's not like, hey, you're welcome, you can come in our space, but we need your voice. We need that. Like, please, we're desperate for your voice. Come to our space so that we can understand better, so that we can learn from you. That's not the world redeemed. That's the way towards the world redeemed.
It's a piece of the puzzle. It's a piece.
Of the puzzle. All right. That's a good piece of the puzzle.
It is.
Okay, we're at the hour here, and so I'll just respect everybody's time, but it's just like, I just love you so much, Benay.
I love you.
You're just like, you have reshaped my my mind again and again, and given me new eyes to see my own tradition with, and that's like, eternal gratitude. Thank you so much for coming to speak to our community. Thanks for kicking this series off. Thanks for challenging us right from the very start, for provoking us right from the very start, and not giving us any easy answers, but giving us truth. You always speak the truth, and I love that about you.
Well, it's my truth. I don't know if it's the truth, but at least it's my best guess at my truth.
Thanks to everybody for being here. And we have 3 more speakers in this series, so check out our website and more info. Maybe Andrew can put more information in the chat, but we've got 3 more exciting speakers come, but this has really just been a dream come true for me to have Benay Lappe at IKAR. So thanks for being here. And thanks
Thank you so much.